Welcome to this explainer. We're not just looking at a date on a calendar or a line on a map today, we're talking about a massive biological collision that fundamentally engineered the reality we live in right now. When Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, it wasn't just some geographical milestone. It was the exact moment the Earth's completely isolated ecosystems violently crashed into one another.
Let's dive right in, because the reality of the world before 1492 is literally mind-blowing. Think about the most iconic foods and cultures today. Before this collision, Italians couldn't make tomato sauce, simply because tomatoes didn't exist in Europe. The Irish had never even seen a potato. On the flip side, Native Americans had never seen a horse, and their immune systems had absolutely zero experience with smallpox. The world was completely segregated by oceans.
So, to wrap our heads around how the world was entirely re-engineered, we're going to break this massive event into 6 parts. The initial collision, epidemic diseases, the exchange of animals, the transfer of plants, global migration and slavery, and finally, the lasting ecological legacy we're still dealing with today.
All right, starting with Section 1, the collision of 2 different worlds.
Picture this. For roughly 12,000 years after the end of the last ice age, the Americas were totally cut off from Asia, Africa, and Europe. That isolation meant evolution was happening on completely separate tracks. And this brings us to a crucial concept coined by historian Alfred W. Crosby in 1972, the Columbian Exchange. The key takeaway here is that this wasn't just simple economic trade. The Columbian Exchange was a massive, permanent biological merging. It was the two-way transfer of plants, animals, people, and invisible microbes across the Atlantic, forever erasing millions of years of biological separation.
But of course, this merging had a devastating dark side. Section 2, Invisible Killers, Epidemic Diseases.
The numbers here are just absolutely staggering. It's estimated that up to 90% of the Native American population perished within the first century of European contact. 90%. And it wasn't primarily the result of warfare. It was mostly due to an invisible, biological invasion.
So why did this happen? Well, the Old World introduced diseases like smallpox, measles, mumps, typhus, and the flu. Over millennia, Europeans and Asians had built up a natural immunity to these diseases. Why? Because they lived in incredibly dense cities and spent thousands of years living right alongside domesticated farm animals like pigs and cows, which are actually the original sources of many of these viruses. The isolated native populations in the Americas barely had any domesticated animals, which meant they had absolutely zero built-in immunity to these specific Old World pathogens.
Look at how rapidly this altered history. Columbus arrives in 1492. By 1519, smallpox is completely decimating the Aztec Empire in Mexico, which paved the way for a few hundred Spanish conquistadors to conquer an empire of millions. The Inca Empire in Peru faced a similar collapse from disease before the Spanish even arrived. But hey, the exchange went both ways. By 1495, sailors coming back from the Americas sparked a massive outbreak of syphilis in Naples, Italy, a disease that would go on to plague European royalty and everyday people for centuries.
Moving on from the microscopic to the massive. Section 3, Animals that Changed the New World.
European livestock completely overhauled the physical landscape and the very cultures of the Americas. Before Europeans arrived, the biggest beast of burden in the Americas was the llama. And llamas are great, but they max out at carrying about 35 kilograms. You can't ride them, and you definitely can't hook them up to a heavy plow. So, the introduction of horses and oxen from Europe, that was a total muscle power revolution. It allowed for the deep plowing of massive fields and long-distance transport that was quite literally impossible before. And the speed at which these animals multiplied is just crazy. Take the story of Hernando de Soto. In 1539, he lands in Florida with just 13 pigs, and the Spanish just let them roam freely to forage. In the Americas, these pigs faced virtually zero natural predators and had an all-you-can-eat buffet of native plants. Within just 3 years, those 13 pigs had multiplied into a massive herd of 700. It provided endless meat for colonists, but absolutely wrecked the native ecology and local farming systems.
But perhaps the most fascinating irony here is the horse. The horse is actually an introduced invasive species to the Americas. Yet, once groups like the Plains Indians got a hold of them, it was a total game changer. They completely abandoned settled agriculture and transformed into nomadic buffalo hunters. That iconic horse-riding Native American culture of the Great Plains that we all recognize, entirely enabled by a European animal.
Now let's flip the perspective. Section 4, Plants that Fed the Old World.
While the Americas were facing demographic collapse and ecological upheaval, Eurasia and Africa had the exact opposite experience. Check out this botanical twist. The Old World brought wheat, sugar, coffee, and grapes over to the West. But moving east to the Old World were absolute calorie powerhouses: corn, potatoes, tomatoes, cacao for chocolate, and cassava. I mean, imagine Indian food without chili peppers, or a Swiss chocolatier without cacao. This exchange literally created modern global cuisine.
But it wasn't just about making food taste good, it was about sheer survival. To put this into perspective, an average 18th century Irish worker was eating roughly 4 kilograms of potatoes every single day. That's a huge amount of food. Because the potato could thrive in poor soils where wheat failed, this one highly nutritious, calorie-dense New World crop basically ended the regular cycles of famine in Europe. It allowed the European population to double, completely shifting the balance of global power.
And we saw a very similar story unfold in Africa. The introduction of the cassava root, which you might know as tapioca, totally revolutionized African diets. Since it thrived in tropical climates and provided a massive amount of calories, it triggered a huge population boom right across the African continent. But, as we'll see in a second, this sets the stage for a deeply tragic historical twist.
Which brings us to the darkest chapter of this era. Section 5. Global Migration and Slavery. We have to map out the cold, hard cause and effect of these demographic shifts. Europeans had set up these massive, incredibly profitable cash crop plantations in the Americas, especially for sugar and tobacco, but they had a severe labor crisis. The native populations had been devastated by disease, and the survivors successfully resisted being forced into the grueling labor of European-style agriculture.
So, to solve this labor shortage, European colonists turned to Africa. Over the course of 4 centuries, an estimated 12 to 13 million enslaved Africans were forced across the Atlantic Ocean to fuel the New World's plantation economy. It remains the largest forced migration in human history, and it forever altered the demographics and cultures of the Americas.
And this reveals a really profound, grim historical irony. The very crops from the New World, like cassava, are what fed that massive population boom in Africa in the first place. And it was that rapidly growing population that European slavers then targeted and violently extracted to work the fields of the New World. It just goes to show how deeply intertwined the biological and human impacts of this exchange truly were.
Finally, let's look at the permanent reality we find ourselves in today. Section 6. The lasting ecological legacy of the exchange.
Let's bring it back to Alfred W. Crosby, the historian who defined this whole era. He summed up the ultimate result of this collision by saying, "The Columbian Exchange has left us with not a richer, but a more impoverished genetic pool." Think of it like this. Before 1492, the Earth was essentially a giant puzzle of highly unique, isolated ecosystems bursting with biodiversity, but supporting a relatively low human population. After 1492, we essentially homogenized the globe. We traded that incredible biological diversity for a standardized global agricultural system. Now, that system is capable of supporting billions of human lives today, sure, but it came at the permanent cost of countless unique species and natural environments.
Which leaves us with a pretty provocative question to consider. The Columbian Exchange gave us the globalized, calorie-rich diets that allow humans to live longer, healthier, and more abundant lives than ever before. But was that biological homogenization, that permanent impoverishment of the Earth's unique biosphere, really worth the price? It's a complex, inescapable legacy, and it is the very foundation of the modern world we are standing on right now. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer.